Sorry about the delay. Running into a few technical difficulties, but I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Sautet for our last Praxis event this year. Dr. Sautet received his doctorate in economics from the University of Paris, and he pursued his postdoctoral studies at NYU under the auspices of Peter Boettke, Israel Kirzner, and Mario Rizzo. He has lectured at the University of Paris, New York University, George Mason University, and is currently teaching at the Catholic University of America. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sautet.
Good evening, everyone. I guess that's a lesson that radical uncertainty is always around us, right? And that's one point. One case in point. My talk was set up with a visual, so I'm going to try to start at least without the visual, and maybe we'll finish it with it. I don't know. The talk was divided, I don't know what I should say, in 6 different parts. The main idea for me is to explore a very old discussion that has taken place in economics and elsewhere about the nature of the human person in political economy. So I'm just trying to see how I should work, because there's a nice quote from JP2 that I should show you. The whole idea starts off from John Paul II, who in one of his encyclicals talks about the idea that we have to accept the understanding of man as a person who finds himself by making a sincere gift of self. And that idea is at the center of his whole discussion about the civilization of love. And I guess reading this, it brought many ideas to mind, but the main one being, if the whole idea of the civilization of love is based on the gift of self, what can really economics teach us in that debate, in that idea of the civilization of love, considering the nature of the human person that is usually known and used in economic science. So that was the starting point of I guess, this inquiry. This is really very much work in progress, and I wanted to share with you where I'm going with it. Many of you, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Catholic social teaching, with econ both. Many of you may not agree actually with what I'm trying to go and what the propositions I've come up with in this talk and in the paper. But you know, I actually wanted to share that with you and maybe start a discussion around this. So I guess the first section has to do with the human person in economics, going back to Adam Smith. Like everyone, I always go back to Adam Smith, which is a very bad thing to do, because we all know that economics predates Adam Smith easily. But it is still an interesting starting point, because when you look at Smith's work, the idea of the person, the human person in Smith's work is actually very rich. He talks about self-interest, obviously, and how self-interest can be mitigated by institutions, by social norms, by morality, and so on. But he also discusses very interesting ideas, such as the idea of benevolence, which is acting with the intention of doing good, or beneficence, which is the idea of actually acting with the intention of doing good to specific persons around us. So all of his discussions in The Wealth of Nations and the Theory of Moral Sentiment is actually, when you try to read that with the glasses of what the human person is like, it's a very rich picture that we have from the start of political economy. Another person or another economist that I find of interest in here is J.B. Say, the French economist of the late 18th century, early 19th century. He's very well known for one thing, which is his interest in the entrepreneur, as many of you may know. And he was a very strong Smithian. Many have seen his work as bringing Smith to the continent, which is very true in many ways. But I would say he goes beyond, because he takes the entrepreneur very seriously, something that Smith doesn't or didn't. And he also provides a very rich picture of the human person. One of the things that is very deeply discussed in his work is the idea of sympathy that is also found in Smith, but is found very much so in the early political economy days, especially in the French school, where the idea of sympathy is vastly discussed. What exactly is the impact of sympathy, the imitation we may engage in of other people, and so on. So if we take the starting points of Smith and Say, it is interesting to see how rich the idea of the human person is. What's even more interesting is how it goes down the toilet from there on. But in some way for good reasons. One of the things I want to reassure you with, excellent, let's try that. One of the things I want to reassure you with is that we may need that's actually not, that's for my, this was for this. So, I have it on my, if you want each one. Or do you want to, no, this page? Is that that's a good one? Well, I guess we'll go the old-fashioned way without. Don't really like those guys at Praxis, they're really bad. I'm just kidding. So, J.B. Say and Smith, to go back to what I was trying to say, we have a very rich understanding of the human person at the beginning of political economy. That changes afterwards. And it is important that you remember that I'm an economist by training, so my goal here is not to actually trash economics, just to explore the limits of what the human person has become in modern economics and what it may mean for our discussion, which is what is the role of economics in the civilization of love. In all of that, one point that I haven't made is that wealth is, the idea of making wealth is very much all around the early discussion of political economy. It is really, political economy is really plutology, so an idea of looking at how wealth is being created, and especially with Say, how it is distributed and how it is consumed. So the making of wealth really matters a lot, and I would say it matters to how the human person is being seen in econ at the beginning. The other person I want to mention here is English political economist John Stuart Mill. Stuart Mill, probably most of you know him very well. He is known in many ways for moving political economy away from the idea of making wealth and bringing the idea of welfare into the discussion. So it's not so much just the idea of wealth, but it's the idea of of what will bring or raise welfare of men, and it could be the pursuit of other things, not just wealth. But in doing so, he's thinking about a very big thing that he reads, I guess, from Smith to Ricardo and many others, which is the idea of the economic principle. And what is the economic principle? It's getting the most for the least. So the idea of getting the most for the least starts to creep in with Mill and others around that mid-19th century view. And why is it important? It's important because the human person slowly becomes seen as that creature that is trying to economize all the time, right? That creature that is getting the most for the least. And the worst light you can put on this is, of course, that the human person is extremely interested in economizing all the time in a point, to the point that it could be downward selfish in some ways. So there are tons of discussions around that time between self-interest and as in the Smithian view of the world and selfishness as in the Homo economicus view of the world. Homo economicus appears at that moment with Mill. Indirectly, he actually doesn't really talk about Homo economicus as such, but we do have Homo economicus coming through. And as I'll mention in section 2, this is the real big issue for many of the critics of political economy. If we fast forward to the beginning of the 20th century, we get to Lionel Robbins. I'm sure many of you know Robbins, who was a famous economist at the LSE in the 1920s and 30s. He was there with Hayek and others. And he comes up with the definition of econ that is still used to this day. And I read, economics is the science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. So with Robbins, basically, what is interesting is that suddenly we talk about ends and any ends, basically. We're not just talking about the pursuit of wealth. We're not just talking about welfare. We talk about any ends that man can pursue in general. And what really matters is not so much the end, but it's the fact that the means are scarce. So it's the idea of scarcity, which was already in the economic principle of getting the most for the least, is really brought to the foreground with Robbins. Now, I will hopefully explain very quickly that I disagree with the idea that any ends are supposed to be encompassed by economics. I think it's actually not true, as we'll see later on. But at least that's the way it's being perceived, that economics becomes neutral towards the end, irrespective of what people may pursue. They may behave economically. But the very big issue, I guess, at that stage is that the human person becomes a calculator. It's all about optimization under constraint. So we get from a very rich view of the human person under Smith, where he discusses benevolence, beneficence, sympathy, and so on, to a cyborg-like understanding of the human person by the 1920s. Now, I think there are good things about this, because it really has brought to the foreground the essence of what the economic behavior is about. What economic behavior is well understood with Robbins. Yet, this has followed a huge impoverishment of the human person, to the point that, again, the human person has become a cyborg. Very famous historian Philip Murawski has actually books on this. The rise of the cyborgs in economics, if you're interested in following this. So we have a new economic principle, which is economics as constraint optimization, which gives rise to that robotic view of the human person. and it has many consequences, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but one of the consequences that two consequences I want to talk about in here is, number one, it implies the rejection of teleology in economics, that ends are not something that define action. There is no purpose anymore, and it's interesting that Robbins doesn't use the term purpose. He used the term ends, which in my view, again, is actually a complete mistake that the Austrians will correct. But so he uses end for a reason, and the rejection of teleology in economics is, in many ways, follows the rejection of teleology in all sciences. The idea that there could be a telos in matter, for instance, that cells or organisms have an end goal, a telos, and that's the reason why they exist, is completely rejected in science. The idea of blind, selection and all of that emerges in the 19th century, and of course it's adopted by economics. So I would say Robbins really characterizes this fully. I have two quotes from Stanley Jevons, for instance, who talks about the mechanics of utility and self-interest, or Edwards, Francis Edwards, an English economist who talks about the economics of calculus of pain and pleasure. So we enter, by the end of the 19th century, in the 20th century, we enter a very mechanistic understanding of the human person, with self-interest being at the center, a bit like gravitation is at the center in standard mechanics. We have a very similar system in econ as we have in physics, and the human person is really reduced to that. Some scholars have talked about mechanomorphism, which is the idea of ascribing mechanical properties to what is otherwise human. In philosophy, I believe they talk about psychophysical reductionism, which is, again, the idea that everything can be reduced to physical elements, and that's really is fundamentally what the idea of the human person becomes in economics in the 1920s and 30s. The other idea that man as a cyborg implies is the rejection of genuine choice in economics. Choice becomes really deterministic. You have preference functions. It is the famous joke that if you give us your preferences, we'll know exactly what you're going to buy next time. And there's actually a lot of empirical work to this day in econ made in order that is done towards establishing what people's preferences are, to the point of, when I was a grad student, some of us were interested in using MRIs in order to look at the brain, and maybe we could map preference functions that way. I don't know where that work has gone, but that was pretty big 15, 20 years ago. So the rejection of modern choice also is there, and is a consequence of seeing man as a cyborg. George Shackle, a British economist, is well known for being criticizing this very strongly. He says choice is a genuine thing, it's not a deterministic idea. Many others, Lachman and so on, in the, as you can see here on the two people that I like and mention in this is the debate that took place at early 20th century between Vilfredo Pareto and Benedetto Croce, two Italian. One was an economist, Pareto, the other one, Croce, was a philosopher. And they discussed exactly this, the nature of choice in economics. And Croce, the philosopher, actually stands against the mechanistic view that Pareto has of human choice, and says, no, and I quote, "The choice with which economics is concerned is not simply the fact of choice, but the fact of conscious choice, the consistent expression of a man's will, of his conscious aiming at a perceived goal." So big debate around this. Again, what does that boil down to? It boils down to the idea of what is the human person in economics, right? So we end up in the first part of the 20th century with a very mechanical, reductionist, and robotic view of the human person, basically. And which, by the way, is my field of my strong field of interest is entrepreneurship theory, and the reason why the entrepreneur is completely absent of 20th century economics, with the exception of Schumpeter and Mises and a few others, is precisely because of the nature of the human person. The entrepreneur cannot be a robot that decides in a deterministic way. That doesn't gel at all. So the entrepreneur goes off the window, of course, and that is a direct consequence of the way the human person is seen. So I guess my question is that the human person that John Paul II has in mind when he talks about the civilization of love? Answer no. And of course, that would, for the critics of economics, that would be, aha, look at what economics is about. Nothing to do with the civilization of love. Forget about economics. That's the wrong science to use. And they have a point. All right. I want to talk about I want to talk about one critic of political economy, which was interesting in that context, in the context of JP2 and the human person. His name is John Ruskin. So I don't know how many of you have come across John Ruskin. He's an obscure now figure, but and for many years I really thought he was obscure and without interest, and then I started realizing that he was very interesting. He lived in the 19th century. He's among all those critics of political economy that you can see that exist in the 19th century. Engels, Carlyle, Veblen, all of those guys, Demers Floyd, Richard Tawney, and so on. And all of you who are studying economics, I really, really encourage you to read those guys, because there's so much to learn from the critics of political economy, much more than you would think, including Engels, who's completely nuts. But he makes some very, very interesting points about the lower classes and what political economists thought at the time. And of course, in the 19th century, you've got all the criticisms that we still know to this day, that economics is all about selfishness, it's coldly logical, it's overly rational, it's free of from emotions and passions, it only describes some robots that seeks pleasure and avoids pain, and so on and so forth. And what you can, I guess, see throughout all this is that there is a fundamental cynicism that people see in political economy. And for many years, I personally thought, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense. Why would they see a fundamental cynicism? And when I started reading Ruskin, I actually came to realize that angle, or where they were coming from. And if you put that in the context of John Paul II's view on the civilization of love, it makes actually a lot of sense. So, and that is not to say that I agree with Ruskin at all, but I think he's got some very interesting point. So Ruskin was a polymath, and he was teaching at Oxford various subjects, actually, and he wrote on many things, including art and history of art and tons of stuff. But he has 2 books on political economy, and he's a critic of it. And the most famous one is called Unto This Last. And the essay that I'm sharing with you in the document that you have, the handout, is called The Roots of Honor. So I'm going to ask a gentle soul in the audience to read the excerpt number 1, so that we know where Ruskin is coming from. Anyone nice enough? There you go. Andrew, go for it.
His work may be very necessary to the community, but the motive of it is understood to be wholly personal. The merchant's first object in all his dealings must be, public belief, to get as much for himself, and leave as little to his neighbor or customer as possible. Enforcing this upon him by political statute as the necessary principle of his action, recommending it to him on all occasions, and themselves reciprocally adopting it, proclaiming vociferously for law of the universe that a buyer's function is to cheapen and a seller's to cheat. The public, nevertheless, involuntarily condemned the man of commerce for his compliance with their own statement, and stamped him forever as belonging to an inferior grade of human personality.
Thank you. So what Ruskin is doing here is that he's comparing the merchant to the soldier, the lawyer, the physician, and basically says the former is belongs to an inferior grade of human personality. It's like, okay, that's interesting. But let's go and see number 2. Another Praxis member wants to redeem himself. I'm just kidding. Alex, do you want to go for it?
I have already alluded to the difference hitherto existing between regiments of men associated for purposes of violence and for purposes of manufacture, in that the former appear capable of self-sacrifice, the latter do not, which singular fact is the real reason of the general lowness of estimate in which the profession of commerce is held as compared with that of arms. Philosophically, it does not at first sight appear reasonable, many writers have endeavored to prove it unreasonable, that a peaceable and rational person whose trade is buying and selling should be held in less honor than an unpeaceable and often irrational person whose trade is slaying. Nevertheless, the consent of mankind has always, in spite of the philosophers, given precedence to the soldier.
So what he's saying here is that soldiers, lawyers, physicians are capable of self-sacrifice. At least they're seen as such. Yet the merchant is not. So to him, the merchant is the incarnation of Homo economicus, right? And so in other words, Homo economicus is not capable of gift of self in his view. I mean, he's really going at the heart of the problem with Homo economicus in many ways, at least as those critics saw it in mid-19th century. Just one more on Ruskin, number 3, in which he says, Charles.
And the duty of all these men is, on due occasion, to die for it. On due occasion, namely, the soldier rather than leave his post in battle, the physician rather than leave his post in plague, the pastor rather than teach falsehood, the lawyer rather than incontinence and justice. The merchant, what is his due occasion of death? It is the main question for the merchant as for all of us. For truly, the man who does not know when to die does not know how to live.
Thank you. All right. So I think it's clear that he has this sense that higher honor, all of this aspect of human action is not depicted by Homo economicus. Okay? Which is why I'm getting at the idea of, is it true that, as Robbins say, that any end are actually encompassed by economics? And that's what I want to explore in this presentation. So to be sure, I wouldn't say that I don't agree with Ruskin's at all in some ways, but I think on this point he's extremely strong, and I want to use that and I see how it resonates with JP2's letter and view of the civilization of love, in order to see to what extent we can integrate political economy and the civilization of love. All right, the second person I want to explore as a response to political economy is Vernon Smith and his idea of reciprocity. I'm sure many of you who study economics know about Vernon Smith, Nobel Prize winner. He's the founder of experimental economics, fantastic guy. He has been fascinated actually for many years by those questions around what did really Smith say, Smith, the Albert Smith, the Adam Smith. What did Adam Smith say? What is the Adam Smith problem, as it's known? What exactly can we explore in here? And can modern economics give us tools or responses to the ideas that they were grappling with in late 18th and 19th century? And Smith, that's where it's going to be problematic, but I'll try to do without it, because I have a tree, a decision tree that Vernon Smith uses. So just imagine a decision tree. Smith, it starts off from the idea of sociality, which basically is that he sees it following David Hume and others as the most compelling feature of human nature. So Smith calls it the capacity for trade, barter, and exchange. Vernon Smith calls it the sociality, but it's all about the idea really of reciprocity in social interaction, which he tries to use in order to understand why social cooperation emerges rather than not. So in the decision tree that you can see here, one of the things he's done, by the way, he's got two really interesting papers if you want to follow up on this. One is called The Two Faces of Adam Smith. I would definitely recommend that paper, it's really good. And the second one is called Positive Reciprocity and Intentions and Trust Games, in which he goes even more in greater details in the ideas that he's talking about. So what he does is, in the experiment, they have paired 24 people. They have 24 pairs, so, sorry, they have 12 pairs, no, 24 pairs, so they have 48 people, and they're paired together. One side of the pair is all persons 1, and the other one is all persons 2. And what happens is persons 1 face the choice of either deciding to get $10 for himself and $10 for person 2, or he can leave that decision to person 2, and person 2 can either reciprocate and say, oh, I'm giving you, the second round they have $40 to share, I'm giving you $15 to person 1 and I'm keeping $25 for me, or I decide to keep all of $40 and I give 0 to person 1. So that means that person 1 stands to lose everything by giving person 2 the decision to choose how to split the money, if unfortunately you don't have the decision tree in front of you. But what it means is person 1 going to share 10-10, or is it going to trust that person 2 is going to reciprocate and give 15-25 in the round 2 of $40? I hope it's clear for everyone. What happens what they find in experimental economics is that 50% of persons 1 prefer the 10-10, 50% give it to persons 2, and persons 2, 75% of the time reciprocates and says, okay, $15 for you, $25 for me. 25% of the time they keep all the $40 for themselves. So Vernon Smith says, aha, you see that when we offer the possibility of social cooperation, and what's important is that that decision tree is visible to all the pairs. Okay, they know what they risk or not risk, in doing this. He said, aha, look, there's possibility for social cooperation, and most people engage in it. And if you repeat the game enough, you get very high level of trust. Okay, which makes sense. Now. Vernon Smith contends that this idea of sociality that he establishes in experiments is exactly what Adam Smith was talking about before, and that the idea of reciprocity is very strong in human beings, and we find it everywhere. So people naturally return the favor, in other words. towards, and most of the time when they're given the possibility to do so. So noble actions such as reciprocity and cooperation are everywhere around us and govern social interaction. That's what Vernon Smith concludes more or less from all of that. Now, you could say that's the response to Ruskin. What are you talking about, Ruskin? You're talking about a being who is not capable of self-sacrifice. I'm showing you that this is not true. I'm showing you that this is not true in experiments. Except that if you remove the social context of the game, meaning if the pairs don't see what they're foregoing or what they can gain, then suddenly the trust goes down immensely. Meaning that persons one will not share with persons two. So reciprocation goes down, if it's a word, if it's not, that's fine. It goes down very quickly when you don't have the social aspect of the game that's there for the players. So I would say it's not clear to me that what he's showing is much different from just the idea of reciprocity is driven from personal gain. So we do have some goodness, we have some benevolence that is being shown by the games, but we don't have beneficence at all. At least that's my interpretation of it, and you may disagree with that. So I'd say that, can human behavior be reduced to reciprocity? No. When I was your age, I was reading things like Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. I don't know if many of you have read this piece of crap. But in Atlas Shrugged, it's interesting because you have friendship that develops, and you know that Ayn Rand has this view that egoism is a virtue, and that love doesn't really exist in his inner world. So the friends are being friends because they reciprocate to each other. And it's very clear in the novel that whenever someone has a debt towards someone else, they would pay it back in gold, of course, because she was good on this. She understood that gold was real value. But there is all that reciprocity everywhere. So it's a society in which people reciprocate constantly. There is no genuine gift. There's none of that going on at all. It's zero. So in some ways, I'd say that all that Vernon Smith is showing is that reciprocity emerges naturally from social interaction, drives social cooperation, but I don't think it's a response to Ruskin nor to John Paul II's exhortation. Right. Second response to Ruskin is von Mises. Von Mises, I'm sure everybody knows him at Hillsdale. We have the holder of the chair, von Mises' chair, sitting here. I'm very impressed. So, what's that? Oh, that's the chair. I don't need to introduce von Mises, so that's going to be very quick. That's good. I need to do that at CUA, by the way, unfortunately, but I don't need to do that here. And Mises, you probably know, talks about purpose. He avoids the whole discussion of whether there is self-interest or no self-interest by just saying all of that is garbage. It's all about purpose. Purpose drives everything. So in that sense, Mises is just like Robbins. He says ends are neutral. Economics is neutral towards the end, and he's right in using the term purpose rather than end. He understands that distinction. So he's more versed in philosophy than Robbins, actually. But so he's focused on that, and through this he says, well, man can pursue any purpose he wants. He can be, or she can be, pursuing materialistic concerns, very highly moral concerns, and so on and so forth. Yet, for Mises, if you recall, all action finds its origin in the removal of felt uneasiness, right? There is no action that does not exist unless you have felt uneasiness. There's a call for action that is driven by the idea that we can improve our being through action. If you go to number 6, it's Human Action, page 92. Is there another gentle soul to read this? Good.
The result sought by an action is called its end, goal, or aim. One uses these terms in ordinary speech also to signify intermediate ends, goals, or aims. These are points which acting man wants to attain only because he believes that he will reach his ultimate end, goal, or aim in passing beyond them. Strictly speaking, the end, goal, or aim of any action is always the relief from the felt of uneasiness.
Thank you. And I would say it is unclear to me to what extent Mises extricates himself from the problem of self-interest. And you will see in a few minutes why it is the case. I can contend that in his mind or in his view, we could probably say that self-interest is always at work. Actually, Israel Kirzner, the great Kirzner, I quote him, says, properly understood, self-interest does not exclude altruistic motivation. Okay, so we have a view in which purpose covers many things that human beings can do, as long as it's about removing felt uneasiness. And we can, in some ways, end up in the idea that there is such thing as self-interested altruism, which I find absolutely weird, as far as I'm concerned, to describe human behavior. So I just leave it at that for the moment. I don't think Mises or Kirzner or many others have a really good, in spite of what they say, and I'll try to prove it in a second, I have a very good response to Ruskin's critique of the human person in political economy. So in order for us to understand what's going on, I want to introduce you to someone I think this time nobody knows in this room. And he's a Spanish scholar who died in the 90s, in 96. His name is Juan Antonio Perez Lopez. And Perez Lopez is not known to most of you, or to any of you probably, because he was an organizational behavior scholar. His field was management theory, and he was also well-versed in theology, in Catholic theology. So he brought the Thomist understanding of the human person into the field of management. Okay, just imagine that. It's interesting. But Perez Lopez, the reason why I'm interested in Perez Lopez is that he talks about three irreducible motives to action that all of us have. Number one is extrinsic motive, number two is intrinsic motive, and number three is transcendent motive. Okay? And we all act at all times on a mix of those motives in our lives. So let me explain what extrinsic motive is. Extrinsic motive motivates action from outside of the person through external incentives. They are controlled by someone else who administer the motivator. So what does that mean is, it's simply a situation where, for instance, you decide to sell your labor and you're compensated for it. When you do that, you act on extrinsic motive that you have. You're compensated for selling your labor, and your action is motivated from outside. If your wage increases, you will probably increase your supply of labor or your productivity or whatever. So there's a direct relation. Let's put subjectivism aside for a second, but there's a direct relationship between the motivator and the extrinsic motive that one may have to act. Okay. Number two, intrinsic motive motivates from within the person through internal incentives, and they are controlled by oneself and are self-administered. Intrinsic motive is what motivates you to act when you go to the gym. Nobody is asking you to go to the gym to work out, to become really strong and handsome. But you think of that, oh, I'm going to go to the beach in July, I better go to the gym or whatever. Now it could be the case, of course, that somebody gives you money to go to the gym if you're in a movie set, for instance, or whatever. I mean, but that would not be intrinsic motive. If you decide to get an A in math just because that's what you want to do. In general, that's intrinsic motivation. Number 3, transcendent motive, just like intrinsic motive, motivates from within the person through internal incentives. But the big difference is that it is for the sake or benefit of something or someone outside the person. So it's what motivates you when, if you're a mother or a father of a family and you work in order to raise your kids. It's what motivates you if you are in the military and you want to defend your country, and so on and so forth. Those motives are at work in the human person, absolutely, at times. So what Perez Lopez says is intrinsic, extrinsic, intrinsic, and transcendent are the irreducible motives to action that you can find at work in any human being. Now, what does that have to do with our debate? Well, my first proposition tonight is that the domain of economic science is human action as it pertains to extrinsic and intrinsic motives only, not transcendent motives. And that is notwithstanding what Philip Wicksteed or Lionel Robbins may say. Wicksteed and Robbins in some ways say the same stuff. They say we have to be completely agnostic about the ends of individuals. There's nothing we can say about this. Wicksteed uses the term non-tuistic. I don't know if you know, in Common Sense, he gives this really famous example of the mother buying milk for her kids. Can you say that the mother is self-interested if she tries to get the best price of milk so she gets as much milk as possible? Or would you say she's altruistic because she does it for her kids? Since he says we cannot know, I'm not talking about neither selfishness nor altruism, I'm talking about non-tuism. And he's right at some level, but I think he's not getting that distinction, really, that Perez Lopez is making between the fundamental motives to action. And I don't want to go into this too much because it's already 8 o'clock, but the idea between Robbins and Wicksteed is that ultimately you probably have a form of self-interest somewhere, and we can discuss that. But I want to go back to Mises for a second, just to, and the idea of felt uneasiness. And like what Mises says, I don't believe that economics is concerned with transcendent motives, or can be concerned with transcendent motives. And one way to discuss this is to look at what Mises says about God. That's interesting. You know that Mises was interested in many subjects, including God. He talks about it in several books, actually, but in Human Action he does, and that's number 7 on your page. Does anyone wants to read this for us, please?
But action can only be imputed to a discontented being, and repeated action only to a being who lacks the power to remove his uneasiness once and for all at one stroke. An acting being is discontented, and therefore not almighty. If he were contented, he would not act, and if he were almighty, he would have long since radically removed his discontent. For an all-powerful being, there is no pressure to choose between various states of uneasiness. He is not under the necessity of acquiescing in the lesser evil. Omnipotence would mean the power to achieve everything, and to enjoy full satisfaction without being restrained by any limitations. But this is incompatible with the very concept of action. For an almighty being, the categories of ends and means do not exist. He is above all human comprehension, concepts, and understanding.
Thank you. So basically what Mises says, and that is very interesting for us in that very debate, he says God does not act because God does not feel uneasiness. That would make no sense. We all know if he's omnipotent and omniscient, there's no uneasiness in God. Therefore, God either doesn't exist, or if he acts, I have no idea what he's doing. It's incomprehensible to Mises, right? But that, I would say, is easy to understand because Mises does not fathom that there is a third motive to act, which is the idea of transcendence. You don't act for yourself, you act for the sake of someone outside yourself. Some philosophers call this effusion. the fusion of love that God, which is the mode of action of God in creation. So ask any theologian at CUA, they will just tell you that Mises has no idea what he's talking about when it comes to metaphysics. And that is true. He's a great economist, but forget about metaphysics as far as Mises is concerned. God is infinite beneficence, and in fact, that's his only mode of action. That's his only mode of action, because God is absolute in the real sense. That he's not dependent on anything. So the only mode of action of God is effusion and transcendence. There's nothing else. He didn't create the world for his own sake, for his own felt uneasiness. He created it for something else, which is us. The John 1st, which is number 8, makes that very clear. Can someone read that very quickly?
Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. This is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins.
All right. I'm sure you've read that passage many times and never thought of it in that context, but that is exactly what St. Paul is saying in some ways, the effusion and the motive of action of God. St. Paul calls this kenosis, the self-emptying, which is in Philippians, letter to the Philippians. We'll pass that. But so I would say human beings may strive to act that way, but they do act based on other motives too, extrinsic and intrinsic. But God always acts in that way. If you go to actually Wojtyła's, which is number 10, Love and Responsibility. Did you want to read that?
Okay.
Number 10.
The fullest, the most uncompromising form of love consists precisely in self-giving, in making one's inalienable and non-transferable I as someone else's property. This is doubly paradoxical. Firstly, in that it is possible to step outside one's own I in this way, and secondly, in that the I, far from being destroyed or impaired as a result, is enlarged and enriched, of course in a superphysical, moral sense.
So you see here how Wojtyła's theory of action is very different from that of Mises. And it comes really to the foreground in, of course, his later encyclicals, but all of that is based on his work on the human person that he did when he was at the University of Lublin in Poland. So this section, to conclude that section very quickly, Ruskin and Wojtyła, in my view, see that political economy is concerned with reciprocity, but not concerned with transcendence at all, okay? Which gets me to the final discussion of this talk, which is, well, what can we say then? Can economics help build a civilization of love or not? And before I respond to that question, it's very important to reiterate what economics can teach by looking at, again, intrinsic and extrinsic motives. It establishes laws and regularities about human action that's undeniable, at least human action in this world, as Mises tells us. And that's against historicism, I would say progressivism and many other isms who see that there is no such thing possible, who deny the regularities in the social world. Historicists are well known for that. That's the whole Methodenstraat, debate. The progressists in the late 19th century thought everything's changing, including human nature. We see that at work today, right, where gender doesn't exist anymore. So since everything's changing, the fact that we do have economics that says, no, that's not true. There's actually some laws and regularities that are extremely powerful at work that are not changing. So some kind of natural law, understanding of human action, that in my view is extremely important. The understanding of sociality The tendency to reciprocate is, of course, a very important human trait that we cannot ignore. That's something that must be known and understood. And Vernon Smith's work is fundamental in that respect. Another point I would say that shows how important economics is it demonstrates that the social order emerges from action and not intention or not design. I would say even more so, it actually shows that social order can emerge without even appealing to transcendence, without appealing to love. You can have a social order that can be established in that way. And this is a very difficult thing to understand for many in the church. I see this at many conferences, at CUA. Theologians cannot think of a society in which that third bond is not in existence. To them, I call them the ethics-only types. To them, the whole system is based on this. There is no such thing really as economics at the end of the day. I was involved once in a discussion with a Jesuit who told me to my face at the beginning of the discussion, economics is bunk. I was like, okay. And it's a good start for the conversation. And I didn't know really what to say, except did you, when you came here, did you actually try to economize on the airfare, or did you take any airfare? So he didn't want to respond to that. But obviously he was acting in one way or another economically. So it demonstrates that social order emerges, and that's a very important thing. And to use Pete Badke's term, I'm sure many of you know him, economics can be seen as a prophylactic against social constructivism. And that's very important. So we get to the idea that, well, Homo economicus, as I've tried to demonstrate it, and again, it's only work in progress, so I'm sure many of you may disagree with me, Homo economicus is limited when it comes to the idea of gift of self. If we go back to that starting point from St. John Paul II, and I would say my proposition here is that economics is definitely necessary but not sufficient to the building of the civilization of love. So that's where I'm trying to bridge those two aspects. And why is that? Well, because human flourishing is only possible if A, we get the incentives right, meaning those incentives that tap into intrinsic and extrinsic motives, but also if we respond to the call to serve, which is the third transcendent motive. So if we want a society that doesn't look like what Ayn Rand describes in Atlas Shrugged, which is definitely not a civilization of love, we have to have somewhere in that equation not only the incentives right, but also the call to serve. But what's important is that many in the church do not think that getting the incentives right matters at all. They don't even see it. They don't even understand it. They don't know that demand curves slow downwards. They don't know any of that stuff. And so this is the big issue, and I would say that this is where those two worlds can be integrated. Now, I want to emphasize, and I'm almost done, that in saying this, I don't invalidate economics. Economics doesn't need to be rescued, like many have said. I would say economics is simply not sufficient. It is simply not sufficient. It's not invalidated by what I'm saying. It's not in need of being rescued. It's just simply not sufficient. And why? Because then ultimately there's a truer view of the human person that cannot be ignored. Let's not be, in other words, let's not be small human beings. When all of you, I'm sure, when you're on holiday and you look at the ocean, you don't think, how much money could I get from the salt that is in the ocean? No, you don't think generally that way. You think how beautiful the world is, and that doesn't stop you from being entrepreneurs and many other things. C.S. Lewis says, we don't want trousered apes. Okay, that's not what we want to be. We want to be something else. And that something else is definitely tapping into the transcendent motive that's there. So man is called to cooperate and co-create with God through a gift of self. Viktor Frankl, I'm sure many of you know him, is an awesome person who survived the camps in World War II. Says it much better than I can. If you look at number 11 on your sheet, can someone read number 11? Please.
By declaring that man is responsible and must actualize the potential meaning of his life, I wish to stress that the true meaning of life is to be discovered in the world rather than within man or in his own self, as though it were a closed system. I have termed this constitutive characteristic the self-transcendence of human existence. It denotes the fact that being human always points and is directed to something or someone other than oneself, be it a meaning to fulfill or another human being to encounter. The more one forgets himself by giving himself to a cause to serve or another person to love, the more human he is and the more he actualizes himself. What is called self-actualization is not an attainable aim at all, for the simple reason that the more one would strive for it, the more he would miss it. In other words, self-actualization is possible only as a side effect of self-transcendence.
Thank you. So, I could go on more, but I think we're going to stop here. All I want to say, it's very important to understand the critics of political economy, because they can teach us a lot about what economics is in terms of its power, its limits, and in that debate of what the civilization of love is. So I hope I've shared with you what, where my thinking is on this issue. Again, it's not fully fledged. I'm sure many of you may have criticisms to tell me, and please do, because I'm interested. But that's it. So, hope that was clear enough without the slides.
Yeah, we have time for like 1 or 2 questions.
Charles.
Great, well, thank you. Great to hear you. I was going to say that I disagree with everything, but actually it was only about 60%.
That's a good start.
Here's what there were a couple of things that struck me as being problems, or that I don't understand. If I don't understand how the transcendent doesn't fit into economics. It seems to me that it does very well, but if it doesn't, then how do people make this? How could people rationally make decisions over what to choose? We did on this point, a student of ours who is graduated now, he's at LSE, Jack Shannon, did a similar presentation, except he was analyzing some Protestant evangelical guy who had written something, and he showed that if you took this guy's ideas seriously, you would devote zero time to anything except the what you're calling transcendent. And these other things are outside of that because they are inferior. Mm-hmm. How do you? And if you can compare them, they come into their own economics.
Well, I guess motives to action are a bit like Kerzner's, fundamental reason why people discover alertness or so. So it's not really a resource that you deploy in your action. It's the reason why you deploy resources in your action. So my way of responding to this is that it's never a choice between the 3 motives. The 3 motives are at work in our will, and we may act in one way or another depending on our character, our pursuit of virtues and things of that sort. I don't think there is necessarily I don't think there is an economic choice between those three modes of action. There are mixed motives that exist in us, just like alertness exists in us in one or another. I'm sure it's not very satisfying to you, but think about the fundamental reason that Mises gives for action. I would say that's the crux of my demonstration. If that crux goes away, then my whole thing is total bullshit. But
That's what I thought.
now, which I understand. I mean, you're coming. If you come from a pure econ perspective, it is very difficult, especially someone who's well trained in Beckerian / Misesian economics, to think that there is no such thing as a domain of human action that is not covered by economics. I mean, after all, Becker brought economics into the family, right? To the point where even Kerzner disagrees on this and thinks that economics shouldn't be there. So, yeah, I can see why you would have a problem with the idea of transcendence not being describable in econ. I think that's the case, that economics doesn't cover transcendence.
Just to make it a little more clear, it struck me when you said it was absolutely weird to think of someone to think of a self-interested altruist, or altruism as being self-interested. That is to me, it's tautological, because the person himself or herself defines what their interests are. That's not something that's imposed for outsiders. So it's impossible for somebody to engage in an action which isn't his or her own, just by virtue of doing it. So it is theirs in that sense. To draw sort of an analogy here, it reminds me of environmentalists who say, we shouldn't be thinking of ourselves, we have to think of what's in nature's interest. What they're actually thinking of is what they think is in nature's interest. And so unless somebody else is imposing this idea, it seems to me it's always in tautologically stuff.
I understand. I perfectly see where you're going. I think as long as you think it that way, then transcendence doesn't exist in that world.
It's not that it doesn't exist, but that it is still an aspect of one's own self-interest, of how one sees.
Well, then, do you think self-sacrifice is done in one's own interest?
I think so. I think it's a word game, sort of, to call it truly self-sacrifice.
Well, then that's where the difference between you and me lie. I don't think self-sacrifice in that view. It's a pure effusion, and done for some other concept. Yeah.
So the example that I use when discussing this in Principles of Mind Curve, and I'm sure I'm not the first one to do it, I probably got it from somewhere, but a mother that sees a car heading for her baby and has to jump in front of the car to push the baby out of the way and save the baby, right? I think a lot of people would describe it as transcendence of some sort, but it seems to me that the explanation is simpler than that, which is that she loves the baby more than she loves her own self, right? So that's certainly explainable in terms of self-interest. She has greater interest in the survival of her baby than her own survival.
Right.
So how would you deal with something like that? I think that's very much building on what Charles was just
saying. I mean, it goes back to what Kerzner says, that properly understood self-interest includes altruism. I mean, that's basically what you're saying. I disagree. I think if everything is reducible to self-interest in that sense, then the notion of true sacrifice doesn't exist.
But you may disagree, but how do you counter this example? I mean, I don't think you can possibly counter that the mother loves her child more than she loves herself. I mean, I think that would be evident on the face of it, right?
Right. I understand what you're saying, but the interpretation in terms of motive that is given is different if you talk about self-sacrifice and gift of self in the pure sense, as opposed to she has a ranking order in which the baby is above her own, and therefore her scale of value is such that it makes sense for her to act that way. I think that's a very economic view of economicist, or whatever you want to call it, view of human action, which is not encompassed by Wojtyła's view that I shared with you or others. But agreed, the line is fine between understanding what true self-sacrifice is, as opposed to it's just you can understand in terms of self-interest. And everything can be understood in terms of self-interest, including altruism. Now, if you are engaging into a trade with someone, and that someone, I mean, I'm sure we live through this every day in Western societies, and sometimes you're saying, wow, that person was very kind to me. And then you're like, oh no, of course not, they want me to be a client. So their kindness was just driven by their interest. Now, the same person being really kind to you genuinely without having no ultimate thought about how it would benefit them. I'm sure we all know the difference between the two. And so that second one is self-sacrifice. The first one is just self-interest. And again, I am not saying self-interest is wrong. I mean, not at all. Self-interest, well understood, extrinsic, intrinsic motives, very important in this world. There's no doubt about it. All I'm saying is that is not in nature, metaphysically speaking, the same thing as self-sacrifice. And economics does not cover this. At least that's the way I see it today. I didn't used to think that in the past. I would be like Kurzner, altruism can be explained by self-interest, of course, no doubt. I think that's totally wrong today. And Ruskin has, in that sense, has a point. Now, does that invalidate economics? No, it doesn't. Does that mean we should put economics in the toilet? No, it doesn't. Economics is very important. If we don't get those incentive rights, we're in trouble. But it just means that the civilization of love is not just that. It's not sufficient. That's all I'm trying to say. But I understand that as an economist, it takes a while to actually think outside that box of everything related to purpose and felt uneasiness, as Mises says. And that's why I go back to Mises' view of God and action. Mises cannot understand why God acts. He cannot, because to him, true self-sacrifice and self-sacrifice and effusion doesn't exist as a motive to action. It just doesn't. It's not there. Does that make sense? A little bit.
Talk about it after.
Okay. I'm sure I'm going to be grilled.
All right, well, I think we're going to officially end there, but as long as Dr. Sautet is okay with it, you can hang around afterwards and ask him more questions. But thank you very much, Dr. Sautet.
No hard feeling, Alex.